orchestrated original Canadian fiction narrative with fresh characters and military dog storyline orchestrated. Original Canadian fiction narrative with fresh characters and military dog storyline. 1. The man in the field uniform planted himself in the middle of the waiting room like he owned the building, looped the leather lead twice around his fist, and told the whole clinic to keep their distance. "Touch him," he said, loud enough that the woman with the cockapoo by the window pulled her dog onto her lap. "He'll take a finger off if he doesn't know you. He's not a pet. He's a working animal." Then he smiled. Not at anyone in particular, just at the room, the kind of smile a person wears when he's decided he's the most important thing in it. Oldie. Holloway heard all of it from behind the reception counter, where she was elbow-deep in a drawer full of microchip scanners, and she didn't look up right away. She'd been a veterinary technician at the Bonachere Animal Hospital for almost 4 years now, and in 4 years you learn that the loudest people in the waiting room are usually the ones most afraid of something. She finished what she was doing. She labeled the scanner. She slid the drawer shut. Dog that made her look up. Not the man. Ort. He was a German shepherd, big through the chest, a black and tan male with the kind of dense undercoat the breed grows when it spent its life outdoors in the Ottawa Valley. He was favoring his right front leg. He held it slightly off the floor, toes barely brushing the tile, and even from across the room, Marin could see the way his shoulder was carrying the weight wrong, the muscle along the top of it gone stringy where it should have been full. He was thin, not starved. Military dogs don't starve. Somebody signs paperwork for their food, but thin in the way an animal gets when it stopped eating well because something hurts and nobody's noticed. Or she knew that shoulder. Well, she told herself she didn't. She told herself that every shepherd looks like every other shepherd from 20 feet, that she was tired, that it was nearly the end of a Thursday in February, and the parking lot outside had iced over twice already, and she just wanted to get through the last 3 appointments and drive home. Her hands had gone still on the counter, and her heart was doing something it hadn't done in a long time, a high-tight knocking like a fist on a door she'd nailed shut years ago. A man's voice cut across the room again. "I've got a 4 o'clock, Master Corporal Dunmore. The dog's name is on the file." Pauline, working the front desk, found it. "Atlas," she read off the screen. "Lameness, right forelimb. Dr. Whitcomb's going to see you in just a few minutes, sir, if you want to." "We'll stand," Dunmore said. Plus, or Marin had to put her hand flat on the counter to keep it from shaking. There were 1,000 military working dogs in this country and probably 50 of them named Atlas. That was a name people gave to big, confident dogs. It meant nothing. It could not possibly mean. Well, the dog had turned his head. He was facing the window before, panting a little, ears working back and forth the way they do when a dog is overwhelmed by a strange room full of smells. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that noise, the cockapoo, the disinfectant, the wet boots, the other people, he found one thread of scent and went still on it. His nose dropped, his ears came forward and locked, and he turned his whole head toward the reception counter and looked straight at her, and his tail, which had been hanging low and flat, gave one slow, uncertain sweep. Then another. "Hey," Dunmore said sharply, feeling the lead move. "Atlas, sit, place." He gave a correction, a short pop on the leash, the kind that's supposed to bring a dog's attention back to its handler. Atlas didn't sit. Atlas leaned his whole 85 pounds against the lead, toward the counter, toward her, and made a sound Marin had not heard in 6 years and had never once forgotten. A thin, breaking whine pushed up out of his chest, high and questioning, a sound she used to be able to stop just by saying his name. Or, she said his name. Or, she didn't decide to. It came out of her low and steady, the way you'd speak to a frightened animal across a road, and she didn't use the parade ground voice the corporal had been using. She used the other voice, the one from the kennels at 6 in the morning with the frost still on the chain link and the coffee going cold on the post. "Easy, I've got you." The dog came apart. There's no other way to describe it. He hit the end of that lead so hard the corporal stumbled half a step, and then he was scrabbling on the tile, claws skidding, the bad leg forgotten, all of him pointed at the gap in the counter where the half door swung open. Marin came around it without remembering deciding to, and she went down on both knees on the cold floor, and the dog crashed into her chest and shoved his great square head under her chin and pressed there, hard, his whole body trembling, that whine going and going until it dissolved into something quieter, a kind of groaning sigh, his nose buried in the side of her neck like he was trying to climb inside the smell of her. Those two. Dunmore started, and his voice had lost some of its edge. Ma'am, he doesn't do that. He doesn't. Get away from him. He's not safe. He knows me, Marin said. Her face was wet. She hadn't noticed it happening. She had both arms around the dog now, one hand spread flat over the heaving rack of his ribs, feeling each one too sharp under the fur, and the dog had his paw, the good one, hooked over her forearm the way he used to as a pup when he wanted to be sure she wouldn't leave. He knows me. It's all right, Atlas. It's all right. I've got you. I've got you. The whole waiting room had gone silent. The woman with the cockapoo had stopped trying to leave. Pauline had a hand over her mouth, and Master Corporal Garrett Dunmore stood in the middle of it with the slack lead hanging from his fist, looking at a soldier's dog that had just refused him completely in front of a room full of strangers, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, he didn't look like he owned anything at all. Or 6 years earlier, Marin Holloway had not been a veterinary technician. She'd been 25 years old and 3 months into the best work of her life, and she'd had no intention of ever doing anything else. She'd grown up in Cobden, a 40-minute drive from the base, the daughter of a man who trained bird dogs in a kennel out behind the house, and a mother who could calm a colicking horse with her hands and her voice and nothing else. Marin had never wanted the city. She'd wanted dogs. So when the opportunity came up to work as a civilian kennel hand in the military working dog program, feeding, conditioning, raising the young prospects before they went into formal training, she'd taken it without a second thought, even though the pay was nothing, and the hours were brutal, and the cold in January came up through the concrete and got into your knees and stayed. She'd been there the day the litter came in. 8 weeks old, a transport from a breeder out west. 6 pups in a crate, and one of them already too big for the others. A black and tan male with ears that hadn't figured out which way they wanted to stand and feet like a moose calf. The handler logging them in had run down the list of names assigned for that intake. They came pre-assigned, alphabetical by litter, and the big one was Atlas. Suits him, Marin had said, and the dog had looked up at the sound of her voice with such open, uncomplicated trust that something in her chest had simply handed itself over, right there, no negotiation. Raised him. That was the job, and she'd known going in how the job ended, and she'd done it anyway because she'd loved every minute of the 11 months in between. She was the one who'd taught him stairs and gunfire and slick floors and the inside of a helicopter, the one who'd sat up 3 nights running when he'd had a bad reaction to a vaccine, the one whose voice he'd learned before he'd learned anything else. He'd slept against her leg in the truck. He'd learned to find her in a building full of people by scent alone, a game they'd played that wasn't training, that was just theirs. And when he was old enough and good enough, and he was so good, the trainer said so, the best prospect they'd seen come through in years, he'd gone forward into the selection stream and been paired with his first real handler, and Marin had stood at the chain link and watched him load into a different truck with a different person, and she had not let herself cry until the gates were shut. Was the deal. You raised them to leave. You loved them so they'd be brave, and then you let them go be brave for someone else. And you started over with the next crate of moose-footed puppies, and you told yourself it didn't break a piece off you every single time. It had broken something off her. She just hadn't known how big the piece was until the thing that broke it for good. His first handler had been a steady man, careful, and Atlas had thrived. Marin got word of him now and then through the kennel grapevine, qualified, deployed, came home. But handlers rotate, and postings change, and somewhere in the second or third reassignment Atlas had passed out of the part of the system Marin could see, and then she'd left. Not over Atlas. Whole impossible arithmetic of it. The way the program ground good dogs forward and good people down. The way she'd come to dread the intake crate because she already knew she'd love whatever was inside it and lose it. She'd handed in her access card on a gray October morning, driven into Pembroke, and signed up for the veterinary technician course at the college because at least at a clinic, the animals came back. At a clinic, people picked their dogs up and took them home. Well, she'd built a life that didn't have a chain-link fence in it. She had a little house on a quiet street with a maple in the yard, and a cat who hated everyone but her, and a job she was good at, and she'd been all right. She'd told herself she'd been all right. And now Atlas was on the floor of the Bonachere Animal Hospital with his head in her lap and 3 of his ribs showing, and he would not let her go. Oresme Whitcomb took one look through the door from the back and read the whole room in about 2 seconds, the way good vets do, and instead of calling the next appointment, she crouched down beside Marin and the dog and spoke very quietly. "Tell me what I'm looking at," she said. "Not to the corporal, to Marin." "He's lame on the right fore, but it's not the leg," Marin said. Her hands were already moving, the old knowledge coming back like she'd never put it down, palpating the shoulder, the dog flinching, then settling, trusting her even through the hurt. "It's the shoulder. Feel here, the muscle's wasted. This didn't happen last week. He's been off this leg for months and compensating, and now the other side's breaking down too. And he's underweight. Look at his coat, it's dull, he's not absorbing." Her voice cracked and she stopped and got it back. "He's in a lot of pain, Dr. Whitcomb. He's been in pain for a long time." "Not," Dunmore said. "Look, he's a hard-charging dog. All right, he gets bumps and bruises, that's the job. The vet on base cleared him last." "When?" Dr. Whitcomb asked, still gently, still not looking up. Pause that went on a little too long. "I'd have to check the file." "Please do." She straightened. "Let's get him into a room and onto the scale, and I'll want films of that shoulder. Marin, can you handle him?" It was not really a question. The dog had made the answer obvious to everyone in the building. They got him into the back, and Atlas walked through the clinic at Marin's knee the way he'd walked at her knee as a yearling, glued to her, leaning, checking her face every few steps. On the scale, he came up nearly 9 kilos under what a dog his frame should carry. The lights, with the corporal made to wait in the consult room and the door shut on him, Marin ran her hands over every inch of the dog she'd raised and found the story written in him plain as a logbook. An old injury to the shoulder that had never been properly rehabbed, just managed with rest and drugs, and pushed back into work too soon, too many times, until the joint had given up. Pressure sores on both elbows from lying on concrete with no bedding, worn flat, and one cracked clean down to the pulp from chewing the bars of a kennel. A thing dogs do when they're left alone too long, when the part of them that needs to be with their person has nowhere to put itself. "He's been kennelled most of the time," Marin said. The radiographs were up on the screen now, and Dr. Whitcomb was reading them with her mouth set in a hard, flat line. "He's not living with his handler. A working dog like this should be bonded, integrated. He should be that man's shadow. He's not. He's terrified of him." "Well, you know this dog?" Dr. Whitcomb asked. Marin, with her hand resting on the broad, warm skull of the animal she'd given away 6 years ago, told her. "The kennels, the intake crate, the 11 months, the chain link, the truck she'd watched him drive away in. By the end of it, Pauline was standing in the doorway with a box of tissues she'd brought back without being asked, and even Theo, the other tech, who'd been a paramedic before this and was not a man who cried at things, had to clear his throat and find something to do over by the autoclave." Whitcomb said suddenly, "Scan his chip." Orrin did. The number came up. Dr. Whitcomb cross-referenced it against the file Dunmore had brought in, and then she did it again, slower, and then she sat back on her stool and was quiet for a moment. "Dog in this file," she said, "is registered as 5 years old, acquired by the department 14 months ago. There's no breeder record, no early training history. The acquisition's logged as a transfer from a private security contractor." She looked at Marin. "How old is your Atlas?" "He'd be 7 this spring," Marin said. "I raised him from 8 weeks. I know exactly how old he is." "Why? And he never went to any private contractor." "He went into the program. He served. He had a name and a number and a record going back to the day he came off that transport." Marin's voice had gone very steady, the way it did when she was angry, in a way too big to let out all at once. Somebody pulled him out of the system somewhere along the line, but he got hold of a trained military shepherd, scrubbed his history, and resold him as a green 5-year-old to a contractor, who flipped him to a handler who didn't know any better and didn't ask. That dog out there ran a working dog into the ground for 14 months and never once knew the animal was already broken before he got him. The room was silent except for the dog's breathing and the hum of the lights. "That's a serious thing to say," Dr. Whitcomb said quietly. "I know exactly how serious it is." Marin looked down at Atlas, who had eased himself down onto the floor at last, the bad shoulder uppermost, his eyes half closed, his head against her foot. A working dog finally, after 6 years and God knew how many hands, lying down somewhere he felt safe. "His chip says it for me. You can't scrub a chip. They forgot the chip." Line. What happened over the next 2 hours, Marin would never be able to lay out in a clean line afterward, because it all happened at once, and most of it happened in low voices in the small rooms of a clinic that should have closed at 5. Whitcomb made calls. She was not a young vet, and she had not spent 30 years in a valley town without knowing exactly which people to phone when something was badly wrong. And she phoned them. The base, a contact in the military police, a woman she knew in the working dog program, who had been there long enough to remember a black and tan prospect named Atlas, and to go very quiet on the phone when she heard he'd turned up half-starved in a civilian clinic registered as a contractor's cast-off. Corporal Dunmore, in the consult room, went through several versions of himself. First the loud one, demanding his dog back, talking about chains of custody and government property. Then a quieter, defensive one, insisting he'd done everything by the book. He'd had the dog vetted, he'd done nothing wrong, and the awful thing was that this was probably true. He had done everything the book asked, just hadn't asked the right questions, because the man who'd sold the dog had made sure of it. And then, somewhere in the second hour, when Dr. Whitcomb laid the radiographs out on the table in front of him and walked him through them bone by bone, when she showed him the worn teeth and the elbow sores and the chip that said this animal was nearly 7 and had a history a mile long that someone had erased. Somewhere in there, a third version of Garrett Dunmore appeared, and this one sat down heavily in the plastic chair and put his face in his hands. "He never settled," he said, to the floor. 14 months. I thought he was just a hard dog. They told me he was a hard dog, green, never properly socialized. That's why he was cheap. I couldn't get near him without him going stiff. I figured I was doing something wrong. I read everything. I tried everything." He looked up, and his eyes were wet and furious, and the fury wasn't at Marin or the dog anymore. "He's been hurting this whole time, and I had no idea. I've been making him work hurt. Jesus, I've been. He couldn't finish it." Lauren stood in the doorway with her arms crossed because she didn't trust her hands, and she watched a man find out he'd been cruel by accident, which is its own particular kind of terrible. And she found, to her surprise and a little to her resentment, that she couldn't hate him. He hadn't smirked because he was cruel. He'd smirked because he was 28 and out of his depth and had built a wall out of swagger so that nobody would see he'd been failing for over a year with a dog he couldn't reach. The dog he couldn't reach had been pining for a kennel in Cobden and a woman's voice at 6 a.m. the entire time, and there had been no way on earth for him to know that. "Well, you couldn't have known," she said, and meant it, and it cost her something to mean it. "He chose you," Dunmore said, "the second he smelled you. 14 months I've had him, and he never once." He shook his head. "He's yours, isn't he? He was always yours." "Point. He was never mine," Marin said. "That was the whole point. We raised them to leave." But her voice didn't believe itself, and the dog, lying in the next room with one ear cocked toward the sound of her through the wall, didn't believe it either. It took 11 days. It was how long it took for the whole thing to grind through the machinery once it had been pushed into motion. The military police investigation that confirmed what the chip had already screamed. The paper trail that led to a man near Trenton who'd quietly diverted 3 working dogs out of the disposal stream and sold them on with forged provenance, the slow, careful work of proving that the animal on Dr. Whitcomb's table was the same animal that had come off a transport crate as an 8-week-old pup 6.5 years before. 11 days during which Atlas stayed at the Bonachere Animal Hospital for medical observation, which was true, and also stayed because nobody had the heart to send him anywhere else, which was truer. He slept in the back, on a thick foam bed Marin brought from home, and he ate, slowly at first, then with the ravenous focus of a dog who's finally relaxed enough to be hungry, and the dullness started to come out of his coat. Dr. Whitcomb operated on the shoulder, cleaned out years of damage, told them honestly that he'd never work again, and might always have a hitch in that leg in the cold, and that he'd live, and that with the right care he had a lot of good years left in him. Warren took the night shifts. Nobody asked her to take. She'd sit on the floor of the recovery ward with her back against the wall, and her laptop open, and Atlas's head heavy across her thighs, and she'd feel 6 years of a particular grief she'd never let herself name draining slowly out through the bottom of her feet. Apartment, faced with the investigation and the photographs and a veterinarian in Pembroke who was not going to let it go quietly, did the thing large institutions do when they've been caught. It moved fast to make the problem look like it had always intended to do the right thing. Atlas, his real record restored, his service finally acknowledged, was medically retired, and under the program for retired military working dogs, he was made available for adoption, with first consideration, by long-standing policy, given to the handlers and personnel who'd served alongside him. Corporal Dunmore came back to the clinic on the 10th day. He stood in the recovery ward and looked at the dog, who lifted his head and regarded him without fear now, but also without much interest. The way you'd look at a stranger you'd once stood in line behind. Dunmore had filled out the adoption paperwork. He had it in his hand. Marin saw it and felt the floor tilt. "Good," he said. "Policy says I could. I'm his handler of record." He looked at the form, and then he looked at the dog, and then he looked at Marin sitting on the floor where she'd more or less lived for a week and a half, and something in his face settled. "But he never chose me, not for one day. I'm not going to make him spend the rest of his life with the wrong person just so I can feel better about the part I played." Crossed the room and crouched down, slowly letting the dog see him come, and he set the paperwork on the floor, turned around so it faced Marin, and slid it across the tile to her. "Raised him," he said. "He's been trying to get back to you for 6 years. Take him home." Or she took him home. It was a Saturday in March, the worst kind of Ottawa Valley day, the snow gone heavy and gray, and the roads running with brown slush, and none of it mattered at all. Atlas walked out of the Bonachere Animal Hospital on a new leash beside her knee, hitched a little on the bad leg the way he always would now, and stopped on the threshold to take a long breath of the cold, wet outside air like a dog deciding whether to believe in something. Then he looked up at her face, checking. The way he'd checked every few steps for 11 months when he was a yearling. The way he'd checked across the waiting room the first second he caught her scent. And whatever he saw there must have been enough, because he stepped out into the snow and didn't look back at the building once. The cat, predictably, was furious and hid on top of the fridge for 2 days, and then climbed down and decided the enormous shepherd, asleep by the wood stove, made an acceptable heat source, and that was the end of that war. He slept the first 3 nights like the dead, all 85 pounds of him sprawled across the foot of her bed, twitching through dreams she'd never know the contents of, 6 years of other people's commands, and other people's kennels and other people's mistakes finally letting go of him in the dark. And Marin lay awake listening to him breathe. This dog she'd loved into being brave, and then handed away because that was the deal. The deal she'd believed in so hard it had driven her, out of the only work she'd ever wanted. And she thought about how she'd spent 6 years telling herself you raised them to leave, and how it had taken a man's careless smirk and a forged file, and 11 days of grief leaking out through the soles of her feet to teach her the thing she should have known at the chain-link fence all along. Come back. Sometimes the piece that breaks off you doesn't stay gone. Sometimes it finds its way home through 85 pounds of black and tan loyalty and a microchip somebody forgot to erase, and lies down in front of your wood stove and sighs, and finally, after everyone in the world has had their hands on him and gotten him wrong, chooses you. Lived another 6 years. His shoulder ached when the weather turned, and Marin went back to the kennels at the base eventually. Not to raise the puppies and let them go, she couldn't do that again, but to help run the program that placed the retired dogs, the old soldiers, into the right homes, so that no working dog who'd given everything would ever again disappear into a forged file and a cold concrete run. We'll name the program after him. Early February, on the gray, iced-over anniversary of the Thursday a loud man had walked into her clinic and told the whole room not to touch his dog. She'd put her hand on Atlas's graying head and feel him lean into it. That same slow, trusting lean, and she'd think the same thing she thought every time. Always knew the way back. She was the one who'd needed showing. For 6 years, I told myself a tidy little lie, that you raise them to leave, that loving something means handing it away with a steady face and not letting it break you. I believed it because believing it let me keep going. But the morning Atlas crashed across that waiting room floor and shoved his head under my chin, the lie came apart in my hands, and I had to look at what was underneath. What was underneath was a chain of small choices, each one leading straight into the next. A man near Trenton chose to forge a file because he was sure nobody was watching closely enough to stop him. Garrett Dunmore chose swagger over admitting he was out of his depth, and a good dog paid for that silence in worn-down teeth and a ruined shoulder. None of it was really an accident. Cruelty almost never is, Oldza. It's a string of moments where somebody could have told the truth and didn't, could have asked one more question and didn't, could have looked instead of looking away. The thing that saved Atlas was the one thing nobody could forge. A microchip the size of a grain of rice slid under his skin at 8 weeks old, carrying a number that said exactly who he was no matter how many hands tried to rewrite him. I've thought about that more than I expected to. You can scrub a record, but you can't scrub the truth of a thing. It stays small and stubborn, waiting for someone willing to scan for it. I learned 3 things in those 11 days, and I'm still learning them. The first is that doing right by something weaker than you isn't a feeling. It's a decision you make over and over, usually when it's least convenient. Dr. Whitcomb could have closed at 5 and passed that file along. She picked up the phone instead, and that choice cost her evenings and made her some enemies, and she did it anyway. Well, the second is that being clever isn't the same as being wise. Wise is reading what's actually in front of you. I nearly hated Garrett on sight, and I'd have been wrong. He wasn't a cruel man, just a young one who'd built a wall out of bravado so no one would see he was failing. The smartest thing I did all week was let myself see the frightened person behind the loud one. Third is the hardest. Atlas spent 6 years being gotten wrong, and he never once stopped looking for the way home. That refusal to let the world turn you bitter. My mother would have just called it grit, and I think she'd have been right. I named the program after him so I'd never forget any of it. Always knew the way back. I was the one who needed showing.